My name is Helen. I'm 29 years old, and I work as a senior accountant at a mid-sized logistics firm just outside of Portland. It's the kind of job most people don't ask much about unless it's tax season, but it's solid, quiet, and has given me something I've always craved: structure. I like numbers. They don't lie. They don't play favorites. They don't turn cold for no reason. I rent a little 2-bedroom apartment on the top floor of a brick building with squeaky stairs and creaky pipes, but I like it. It's mine. It's peaceful. On weekends, I bake. I light candles that smell like vanilla or cedar. I go to the farmer's market. I read in silence. I don't answer the phone unless I want to, and I almost never go back to my hometown. I don't think most people realize how early certain dynamics in a family get set, how quickly love can become conditional. In my case, it started the day my sister Julia was born. I was 5, and overnight I went from being someone's everything to someone's afterthought. Julia was delicate, bright-eyed, and loud in all the ways I wasn't. She cried often, needed constant attention, and my parents gave it willingly. I adapted. I learned to be helpful, quiet, low maintenance. I got good grades, didn't complain, did what I was told, and in return I got not much. No applause, no praise, just expectations. Just silence when I met them and disappointment when I didn't exceed them. But Julia? She could do no wrong. Every drawing was a masterpiece. Every tantrum just a phase. If I ever dared to voice resentment, I was told I was being selfish, that being older means being more mature. So I matured. I stopped asking for things. I stopped needing them. Or at least I told myself I didn't. By the time I was in high school, I was already planning my exit. I applied to colleges across the country and ended up in Oregon with a partial scholarship and 2 suitcases. I remember my mom barely looked up from her phone when I got into the car to leave. Julia was crying because her goldfish died that morning. That's what got the attention that day. And maybe I should have stopped hoping right then and there, but I didn't. Because some part of you always waits for the apology that never comes. 7 years ago, I went back for Julia's birthday. She was 21 and her fiancé had just proposed a few weeks earlier. I wasn't close to her. We hadn't really stayed in touch. But I thought maybe this would be different. I bought a dress. I got my hair done. I even picked out a thoughtful gift. I told myself I'd be gracious, supportive, the good daughter. We were sitting at the long oak table in my parents' dining room, the same one I used to do math homework on while Julia painted her nails nearby. Everyone was passing plates of baked chicken and mashed potatoes, glasses clinking. It was almost nice. Almost. Until my father stood up, fork tapping his glass. He cleared his throat and smiled at Julia. "To our shining star," he said, "the one who's always made us proud. We've always known she was destined for something special. Some of us take longer to find our path, and that's okay, but Julia, you've always had our hopes in you." Everyone clapped. My mother dabbed at the corner of her eye, and I just froze. I wasn't mentioned, not even in passing. It was as though I didn't exist, or worse, that I had, and they had already decided I wasn't worth toasting. Something inside me shifted then. Something old and tired and done pretending. I stood up, quietly. No yelling, no tears. I placed my napkin down beside my plate, turned and walked out of that house without saying a word. I heard my mother's voice behind me. "Helen, don't be dramatic." But I didn't stop. That was the last time I saw them. And strangely, once I got into my car and shut the door, I felt lighter, like someone had untied a weight I didn't even know I was dragging. I never called back, never wrote, and they never really tried. A birthday card once, signed only Mom and Dad. No phone call, no apology. And yet, that night was the beginning of something I didn't even know I needed. It was the first moment I chose myself over the story I'd been assigned in that family, the lesser daughter, the one who didn't sparkle, because I do sparkle, just not for them. But they would learn. Eventually. After I left that night, I drove for hours, not to any particular place. I just needed to move. To feel the road under me, the cool air through a crack in the window, something constant and indifferent to what had just happened. I ended up at the coast. It was close to midnight when I parked in an empty lot near a cliff and just sat there, staring at the dark ocean. I wasn't crying. I thought I would be, but I wasn't. I felt hollow, the way a house feels when the furniture's been removed, but the outlines still remain on the carpet. I remember thinking, so this is it then. This is what they've always thought of me. And it wasn't even the first time I'd heard some version of that toast. Not directly, of course, but in glances, in silences, in the way they reacted to her triumphs and my effort. Julia was the chosen one. Always had been. I was the spare. Reliable, invisible, disposable. Still, something about hearing it so plainly, so publicly, like it was a family truth they didn't even need to hide anymore, that gutted me. They didn't say I was a failure, but they said everything but. Some of us take longer to find our path. As if I were lost. As if the life I'd built meant nothing. When I got home, I made myself a cup of tea and opened my laptop. I remember thinking that I needed something, anything, to feel like mine again. So I updated my resume. I wasn't even job hunting, but it felt like an act of defiance, a way to remind myself, I have value, I've done things, I am not who they think I am. In the weeks that followed, I waited, half hoping, half dreading that someone would call, that maybe my dad would say, that came out wrong, Helen, that Julia would send a message, but nothing came. Nothing except a holiday photo 3 months later. Julia and her fiancé in matching pajamas, holding wine glasses in front of the fireplace, my parents beaming in the background. It took a long time to stop checking for signs that they'd noticed my absence, but eventually, I did. 2 years passed like that. Quietly. Steadily. I threw myself into work, took on more clients. I earned a promotion, bought a new car, found small joys in things I used to overlook, reading in the morning sun, a perfectly balanced spreadsheet, a day that ended without someone making me feel small. And then, one morning, I saw her, Julia. I was waiting for coffee at a little cafe I'd recently discovered downtown. It was one of those places that smelled like fresh pastry and played Ella Fitzgerald on low volume. I was answering an email on my phone when I heard her name. Julia? A woman behind the counter asked, holding up a paper bag. The girl who reached for it turned, and my breath caught. Her hair was shorter and she looked thinner, somehow both older and more childlike. Her eyes met mine. There was a long pause, then her face crumpled. She didn't cry, not exactly, but her expression said everything. Surprise, shame, regret, maybe even something like relief. I blinked. She stepped closer. Hi, she said, her voice small. I nodded. Hi. There was a long silence. I didn't think I'd see you, she finally said. I mean, I figured you were still in the city, but... I shrugged. I live nearby, just grabbing coffee before work. She bit her lip. You look... Great, really, you always had that polish thing. I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. Thanks. She looked down. I'm working just down the street, the grocery store actually. Register 5, that's me. It was such a small thing, but it landed hard. This was Julia, the golden child, the one they toasted while ignoring the daughter who'd quietly rebuilt herself. She was bagging groceries now. I see, I said gently. How have you been? And that's when it spilled out. The fiancé, gone. Walked out after a year of marriage. Turns out being pretty and agreeable doesn't fix a man who never wanted to grow up, she said with a bitter laugh. Moved back in with our parents, took the cashier job to pay off debt. They're supportive, but... She trailed off. But I knew what that but meant. They're disappointed now. The shine's worn off. She asked if we could catch up sometime, maybe get lunch. I miss you, she said. I really do. And maybe she did. But I wasn't ready. Not then. I told her I was busy with work, but maybe sometime. We hugged, briefly. Her coat smelled like peppermint and something burnt. When I got home, I sat on my bed and just stared at the wall. I should have felt satisfaction. Justice. I should have said to myself, finally they see what they had all wrong. But mostly, I felt tired, not because she was struggling, but because it had taken this long for the scales to even begin to balance. Still, something had shifted, a quiet confirmation. Maybe I didn't need their apology. Maybe watching the golden daughter stumble while I stood unshaken was all the closure I would ever get. And maybe that was enough. After that encounter with Julia, I couldn't stop thinking about how strange it all felt, like two ghosts bumping into each other at a train station, people who once shared a home, a history, a last name, now orbiting in separate galaxies. I thought about reaching out. I really did. I thought about sending her a message, asking how she was doing, offering that lunch she suggested. Not out of pity, God, not that, but because a part of me still wanted to know what went wrong. Not just in her life, but in ours, as sisters, as daughters, as women raised under the same roof but fed entirely different stories. But every time I picked up my phone, I hesitated, because I remembered the sound of her laugh at that birthday party. Not cruel exactly, but complicit. She had smiled when Dad gave that toast. She didn't say a word when I stood up and left the table. She didn't chase me, didn't call, didn't even text. And maybe she'd been too wrapped up in herself, in the fantasy of her engagement and her place on the pedestal. Maybe she didn't see how hard it hit me. But I wasn't interested in rewriting the past to make it more comfortable. I've learned that not every relationship deserves a second chance, especially when the first one wasn't built on anything solid to begin with. Still, seeing her like that, deflated, exposed, a cashier with tired eyes and a bruised heart, planted something in me. Not satisfaction exactly, not revenge, but something colder, steadier, a quiet sense of justice. Because for so long, I had been the one quietly sitting in the shadows, watching the way they bragged about her, dismissed me, reshaped every family story to feature her in the starring role and me as the invisible extra. I had internalized that role. Even when I succeeded, part of me still felt like I had to prove something. To them, to her, to the version of myself that believed I was always second best. But that night, as I stood in my kitchen sipping tea with the lights low and the city glowing outside my window, I realized something that surprised me. I didn't feel inferior anymore. I didn't feel anything at all. And in some strange way, that neutrality was more powerful than any triumph I could have orchestrated. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to throw her failures in her face. Life had a way of leveling its own playing field, of softening illusions, of reminding people, gently or brutally, that no one is immune to reality, especially not golden daughters. Weeks passed, then months. I didn't hear from Julia again, but one afternoon, I got a letter in the mail. The handwriting was familiar, my mother's. It wasn't long, just 3 folded pages. No return address, no dramatic salutation, just words. Measured, careful, almost sterile in tone. She wrote that she hoped I was well, that she had heard from Julia that we'd run into each other, that things haven't been easy at home, but everyone makes mistakes and families should stick together. She didn't mention the birthday, she didn't apologize, she didn't own anything, but she closed it with, "We'd love to hear from you. The door is always open." I stared at that line for a long time. The door is always open, as if I'd merely gone out for a walk, as if 7 years of silence and dismissal could be undone by a key that no longer fit. And still, part of me wanted to go back, just for a visit, just to show them who I had become. But that's when I realized they don't deserve to see me now. Not this version, not the woman who had clawed her way out of their shadow, who had stitched herself together without their help. Not the woman who had built a life rooted in truth, not fantasy, in self-worth, not approval. So I folded the letter, I placed it in a drawer, and I never wrote back, because some doors stay closed, not out of anger, but out of choice, out of peace. A few months later, I saw Julia again, this time from across the street. She was walking with our mother, carrying 2 plastic bags from the dollar store. Their faces were tight. Neither of them looked happy, just tired, worn down by years of living for appearances and nothing else. They didn't see me, and I didn't call out. I just kept walking. And in that moment, I realized I had finally stepped out of the story they had written for me and started living the one I chose for myself. I used to think healing looked like reconciliation, like two people sitting across from each other in a coffee shop, teary-eyed and vulnerable, saying all the things they should have said years ago. I imagined some version of that scene playing out between me and my parents, or maybe Julia, one of them finally looking me in the eye and saying, "We were wrong. We should have seen you. You were never less." But healing didn't come from them. It came quietly, slowly, like water smoothing a stone. It came from showing up for myself in ways they never did, from learning that self-worth doesn't arrive in the form of applause or attention. Sometimes it grows in silence. Sometimes it comes from walking away and not looking back. By the time I turned 30, I had stopped waiting for them. I remember that birthday clearly. It was the first one I spent entirely on my own terms. No awkward phone calls, no forced dinners. I took the day off work, went for a long walk through the Japanese garden, then treated myself to sushi and champagne. I sat by the window in a quiet restaurant, journaling, watching the light change on the water. And I didn't feel alone. I felt free. There's something liberating about living a life you built with your own hands. Not inherited, not granted, not handed down with strings attached, but earned. Quietly, day by day, my work was going better than ever. I'd earned another promotion and now oversaw a small team. I'd become the go-to person for tough cases, complex accounts, sensitive audits, nonprofit clients with messy books. Numbers never made me feel small. They responded to attention, to order, to logic, unlike people. I'd also started teaching a night course on budgeting and personal finance at a local community center. Nothing fancy, but fulfilling. Seeing single moms walk in unsure and leave with notebooks full of hope. It mattered. It made me feel like I had something real to offer, something rooted in more than titles or diplomas. Meanwhile, back home, Julia's situation continued to decline. I wasn't looking for updates, but they found me. Through mutual acquaintances, social media snippets, people from high school who still followed both of us out of habit. It was never anything direct, but I started to piece it together. She'd gone back to school, briefly, but dropped out. Took a second part-time job, still living with our parents, still struggling to find herself. From what I could gather, things at home weren't great either. My mother had developed some chronic health issues. My father had taken early retirement, but resented it. The house was slowly falling into disrepair. At some point, Julia posted a photo of herself in front of the grocery store, wearing a faded name tag and holding up a plastic bag of store-brand cereal with a sarcastic smile. The caption said, "Living the dream." I stared at that photo for a long time. Not because I enjoyed seeing her like that, but because for the first time she looked real, not polished, not precious, just human. And oddly, I felt compassion, not the kind that demanded I go running back to fix anything, but the kind that comes with distance, with perspective, the kind that says, "I don't wish you harm. I just no longer carry the weight of your choices." A few weeks later, I ran into her again, this time at the library. She was standing in front of the computer kiosk, struggling with something. I could see the frustration on her face before she even noticed me. I almost turned away, but she spotted me first. "Hey," she said, blinking like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to say it. I nodded. "Hey." She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "You always liked this place." "I still do." She glanced at the screen, then back at me. "I'm trying to apply for a new job. It's one of those applications that makes you sign in 3 times and still won't load." I walked over. "Here, let me try." She stepped aside, and I fixed it in 30 seconds. She laughed, a little embarrassed. "Guess I should have asked for help sooner." And I could have said something smug, could have let that moment hang in the air with all its history and irony, but I didn't. Because something in her eyes looked different, softer, more tired maybe, but less guarded. "Hope it works out," I said. She swallowed. "Thanks." There was a long pause. Then she added, "You really got out, huh?" I met her gaze. "Yeah, I did." She nodded slowly. "I used to think I was the lucky one." I didn't say anything. She wasn't looking for a response. just speaking a truth she'd only recently come to understand. We didn't hug, we didn't exchange numbers. But when we walked away from each other that day, something had shifted. Not fixed, but shifted. And that was enough. Because some stories don't need a perfect ending, just a turning point. It's strange what you remember, not the big, obvious moments. Not always. Sometimes it's the sound of someone's voice through a closed door, the way the air felt thick and still in a room where something was left unsaid, or how, even as a child, you could tell when the love in a house wasn't pointed in your direction. That's how I remember my childhood, not in scenes of outright cruelty, but in the details, in the quiet exclusions, in the way Julia's report card was hung on the fridge with magnets and mine got tucked into drawers, the way her birthdays were events, themes, guests, photos, while mine were always just a small family thing, the way my accomplishments were met with polite nods while hers were treated like miracles. And yet I spent years thinking maybe it was my fault, that I hadn't tried hard enough, that if I were just a little brighter, a little less sensitive, a little more like her, they'd see me. But I was wrong. It was never about me. And that's what finally gave me peace. It didn't come all at once. Healing rarely does. It's not some cinematic moment where you close a door and walk into sunlight. It's slower, quieter, like a door inside you that stops creaking every time the wind moves through, like waking up one day and realizing you didn't think about them yesterday or the day before. Still, there were moments that reminded me just how far I'd come. One evening, almost a year after I ran into Julia at the library, I got a phone call from an unfamiliar number. I let it go to voicemail. Later, when I listened, I recognized my father's voice. He sounded tired, older. "Hi, Helen, it's Dad. I know it's been a long time. Your mother's not well. She's been in and out of the hospital. I know you probably don't want to hear from us, but Julia thought you should know." There was a pause. Then, "We'd love to see you, if you want. But I understand if you don't." He hung up without saying goodbye. I sat there for a long time after the message ended, not crying, just still. It wasn't guilt I felt. It wasn't even anger. It was something closer to grief, but not for them, for the version of me that had waited so long for a call like that. The girl who used to lie awake wondering what she'd done wrong. The woman who once walked away from a birthday dinner with a hollow in her chest and no language for why it hurt so much. I could have called him back. I could have gone to the hospital. Sat beside my mother's bed, said the things good daughters are supposed to say, but I didn't, because I'd learned something vital over the years. You don't owe your peace to people who contributed to your pain and never took responsibility for it. I hope she's okay. I really do. I don't wish her harm, but I'm not the one to show up for her now. I showed up for years, and it wasn't enough then. It never would be. Instead, I showed up for myself. I kept teaching at the community center. I started mentoring a young woman at work who reminded me of myself at 22. Bright, quiet, unsure of her voice. I helped her find it. I watched her grow. I even fell in love. I wasn't expecting it. I wasn't even looking, but it came slowly, gently. A man who didn't need me to shrink so he could shine. A man who asked questions and listened, who laughed with his whole face, who never once made me feel like I was second to anyone. He met me where I was, fully formed, fiercely independent, and not looking for a rescuer. We built something new, honest, equal. The first time I introduced him to my friends, someone asked what had drawn me to him, and I said, without hesitation, "He sees me." That was it. That was everything. Years passed. Julia and I crossed paths again from time to time, at the grocery store, at a bus stop once, walking across the same plaza downtown. We'd exchange small talk, weather, work, books. Once she told me she'd finally moved out of our parents' house, got a roommate, was thinking about going back to school. I wished her well, and I meant it, because by then I wasn't holding the rope anymore. I wasn't waiting for an apology or an acknowledgement. I wasn't trying to rewrite the past. I had written a new story, and in that story, I was no one's afterthought. One spring morning, I took a trip back to my hometown. I hadn't been in years. I didn't go to visit anyone. I just needed to see it, to walk the streets where I once felt invisible and remember that I had left and stayed gone, that I had created a life that didn't require their validation. I walked past the old house. It looked smaller than I remembered. The shutters were peeling. The yard was overgrown. But I didn't feel sad. I felt free, because I knew that my life had not been a reaction to theirs. It had become its own creation, built with purpose, with pain, with clarity, with love. And I think that's what I want anyone listening to this to understand. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most don't. Not in the way you needed. And that can hurt deeply. But it doesn't have to define you. You can step out of the story they wrote for you. You can write your own, and you can make it beautiful.